On the planet Zareth, the Azeri people had everything. They were tall, elegant beings with shimmering silver skin and glowing violet eyes. Their cities floated in the air, powered by crystal technology, and their knowledge of science surpassed most species in the galaxy. Yet for all their greatness, there was one thing they could not fully understand: humans. The humans of Earth were a mystery, a strange species that many Azeri believed to be nothing but a myth. Stories told of their unmatched ability to adapt, survive, and even create life in their own way. Some even said humans had a way of breeding, which made them more resilient and stronger over generations. To the Azeri, this sounded impossible. Humans? Bah. Fairy tales for children, the elders would say. But there was one Azeri who did not laugh. Thyra, a young scientist with a sharp mind and even sharper curiosity. Thyra had always been different. While others enjoyed the comforts of Zareth's perfect cities, she spent her days studying old galactic records. One evening, deep in the archives, she found something strange, a distress signal. It was ancient and weak, but the language was unmistakable. English. Her heart raced. English belonged to humans. Could it be true? Could humans still exist? Thyra took the recording to her mentor, a gray-skinned elder named Zalrin. He glanced at it with disinterest. Just noise, Thyra. Humans are myths. The council won't waste resources chasing fairy tales. But this is real, Thyra insisted. The signal comes from the moon of Aura's 9. What if humans are there? Zalrin sighed. Humans are dangerous, if they even exist. The old stories say they breed chaos as easily as life. They are not like us. Thyra didn't care. Her curiosity burned brighter than ever. The thought of seeing a human, of discovering the truth, pulled at her mind like gravity. That night, Thyra made a decision. She would not let this signal go unanswered. With the help of her friend Kale, a daring pilot who owed her a favor, she secured a small ship and set a course for Aura's 9. As the ship launched into the cold blackness of space, Thyra watched Zareth shrink behind her. "This is madness," Kale muttered from the cockpit. "Or discovery," Thyra replied, her eyes fixed on the distant stars. The journey was rough. Aura's 9 was a cold, desolate moon, hidden in the shadow of a gas giant. As the ship descended, the scanners picked up something unexpected, a faint energy signature near the surface. "There's something here," Thyra whispered, excitement rushing through her veins. Kale looked at her nervously. "Let's hope it's not a mistake." The ship touched down with a soft thud. Outside the window, the ground was covered in blue frost, and strange, jagged mountains loomed in the distance. Thyra's heart pounded. She was closer to the truth now. If humans were real, she would be the first Azeri to prove it. Taking a deep breath, Thyra stepped off the ship, into the unknown. The air on Aura's 9 was thin and cold, biting at Thyra's skin through her protective suit. Blue frost crunched beneath her boots as she stepped further from the ship, her eyes scanning the barren landscape. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the soft hum of the scanners Kale carried. "Thyra, this place is a graveyard," Kale said, his voice crackling through the communicator. "Are you sure about this?" She didn't answer immediately. Her focus was fixed on the weak energy signature blinking on her handheld device. It was faint but consistent, drawing them toward a canyon surrounded by jagged mountains. "I know what I saw," Thyra replied. "Something, or someone, is here." They descended into the canyon, the walls narrowing as they went deeper. Strange symbols, scratched into the rocky surface, caught Thyra's attention. They were crude but deliberate. Kale stopped. "These marks, they're not Azeri." Thyra knelt, brushing frost from one of the carvings. "They're human," she whispered. Before Kale could respond, a sound echoed through the canyon. A low, metallic clang, like something heavy being dragged. Thyra's head shot up, her heart pounding. "What was that?" Kale asked, his voice tense. Thyra stood, gripping her scanner tightly. It came from up ahead. Against Kale's protests, she moved toward the sound, her footsteps careful but determined. The canyon opened into a wide clearing, and there, half buried in the ice, was a massive metal structure, a wrecked human ship. The ship's hull was cracked, rusted, and covered in frost, but its design was unmistakably human. Thyra's breath caught in her throat. They were here, she said, her voice trembling with excitement. Humans were really here. Kale was less impressed, and it looks like they didn't survive. Before Thyra could argue, the sound came again, closer this time. She turned sharply, her eyes darting to the shadows cast by the broken ship. Movement. "Who's there?" Thyra called out, her voice echoing. For a moment, there was silence. Then from behind a jagged piece of the hull, a figure emerged. It was a man, tall, rugged, and wrapped in torn clothing that looked nothing like a Zeri attire. His face was partially hidden behind a makeshift mask, but his piercing brown eyes stared straight at Thyra and Kale. Thyra froze. Her heart raced. This was no myth, no legend. This was a human. "By the stars," Kale whispered. The man raised a hand, not in threat, but as if to show he meant no harm. His voice, rough and unfamiliar, broke the silence. "You, Azari?" he asked, his accent strange but understandable. Thyra couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The myths were true. Humans existed, and she was face to face with one. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice shaky. "We are Azari. Who are you?" The man pulled down his mask, revealing a face weathered by time and survival. A faint, crooked smile appeared on his lips. "Name's James," he said, "and you're the first friendly faces I've seen in years." Thyra stared at him, unable to look away. 1,000 questions burned in her mind, but one thing was certain. This was only the beginning. James stood before Thyra and Kale, his worn-out clothes fluttering in the cold wind. His face was lined with exhaustion, yet his eyes burned with the same curiosity Thyra felt. For a moment, the three just stared at each other, two Azeri explorers and a human who should have only existed in myths. "Are you real?" Thyra finally asked, her voice trembling slightly. James chuckled, a rough sound that seemed to echo through the frozen canyon. "As real as it gets, lady, unless I've finally gone crazy." Kale frowned, his hand drifting to his sidearm. "How did you get here? Humans don't travel this far into space." James turned and gestured to the wrecked ship behind him. "That beauty brought me here. It was a colony ship, one of the early ones. But things went bad during the journey. Systems failed. Engines broke down. We crashed on this frozen moon." Thyra's eyes widened. A colony ship. But that was hundreds of cycles ago. "Yeah, no kidding," James replied bitterly. "I've been stuck here longer than I can remember. Most of the crew didn't make it. Those who survived." He paused, his expression darkening. "Well, let's just say I'm the last one left." Thyra felt a pang of sadness. Humans were resilient, but even they couldn't fight against time and isolation forever. She stepped closer, her curiosity overwhelming her caution. "How did you survive all these years?" James smiled faintly, the lines on his face softening. "Humans are stubborn creatures. When life knocks us down, we get back up. I built shelters, scavenged what I could from the ship, and found ways to grow food, barely enough to live on. It wasn't pretty, but I made it." Kale still looked suspicious. And the legends. About breeding and creating life. James raised an eyebrow and then burst out laughing. It was loud, unexpected, and echoed through the canyon. Kale frowned, his hand tightening on his weapon. "You Azeri really believe that nonsense?" James asked, wiping a tear from his eye. "I mean, yeah, we can reproduce, but it's nothing magical. Humans are just good at adapting. We survive when others can't." Thyra's cheeks turned a faint shade of purple, the Azeri equivalent of embarrassment. "The stories were unclear," she admitted, "but we didn't know humans were so real." James smiled and shook his head. "Well, here I am, flesh and blood. So what now? You came all this way just to find me?" Thyra hesitated. She hadn't thought that far ahead. Finding a human had been her only goal, but now that James stood in front of her, the possibilities seemed endless. "We want to help you," she said firmly. "You don't have to stay here. Come back to Zareth with us." James's smile faded, and for the first time, Thyra saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He glanced at the frozen horizon, as if searching for something unseen. "I don't know if that's a good idea," he said quietly. "There's something else on this moon, something I haven't told you about." Kale stiffened. "What do you mean?" James looked back at them, his face serious. "You didn't think I survived all these years alone, did you?" A chill ran down Thyra's spine. Suddenly, the quiet moon didn't seem so empty anymore. Thyra's heart skipped a beat. James's words hung heavy in the cold air. "You didn't survive alone?" Thyra asked, her voice low. James nodded, his face grim. "There's something else here. I call them the shadows. I don't know where they came from, but they've been watching me for years. At first, they stayed away. Now they're getting bolder." Kale stepped forward, his hand resting on his sidearm. "What are they? Beasts, machines?" James shook his head. "I don't know. They move fast, always out of sight. Sometimes I hear them scratching against the metal of the ship at night, testing it. I've only seen their shapes, tall, thin, and wrong. I think they're hunting me." A chill ran through Thyra. The barren moon had felt unsettling enough, but now the shadows James described made every corner feel darker. She glanced at Kale, who looked equally uneasy. "You should have told us this before," Kale muttered. James smirked faintly. "Would you have stayed?" Thyra tightened her grip on the scanner. "We're here now. If these shadows are dangerous, we need to leave." James sighed, looking back at his broken ship. "I've wanted to leave this place for years, but I couldn't risk drawing them out. They don't like noise and engines. Engines bring them running." Kale frowned. "So we're sitting targets." James nodded slowly. "Pretty much." Before Thyra could speak, a sudden metallic clang echoed through the canyon. The sound bounced off the ice walls, sharp and unnatural. James froze, his eyes wide. "They're here," he whispered. Kale spun around, pulling his weapon from his side. "Where?" "I don't see anything." "Stay close," James barked, his voice low. "They hide until it's too late." Thyra's scanner beeped frantically. The device picked up strange movement all around them, fast blips appearing and disappearing. Her skin prickled with fear. "I'm getting readings. They're moving around us," she said. The air seemed to grow colder. The silence was worse than the sound, stretching on until a faint scratching noise began. It came from above, along the cliff edges. Thyra looked up and felt her blood freeze. Silhouettes stood on the cliffs, tall and thin, just as James described. They moved strangely, almost twitching, as though their bodies couldn't decide how to hold themselves. "There," Thyra shouted, pointing. Kale aimed his weapon, but before he could fire, the figures melted back into the shadows. James grabbed Thyra's arm, pulling her toward the wrecked ship. Move. Get inside, now. They ran, the frost crunching beneath their boots. The scratching grew louder, like claws raking across stone. Thyra's heart pounded as they stumbled through the broken entrance of James's ship. "Seal it," Cale shouted, slamming the heavy door shut behind them. Inside, the ship was dark and cold, but for now it was safe. Thyra could hear her own heavy breathing as she leaned against the wall, trying to calm herself. "What were those things?" she asked James. He lit an old lantern, the warm light flickering across his face. "I told you, they are shadows, and they don't stop until they get what they want." Cale stared at him. "And what do they want?" James looked at the two Azeri explorers, his expression grim. "Me." Outside, the scratching began again, slow and steady. The shadows were waiting. The scratching outside grew louder, like nails dragging across the hull of James's broken ship. Thyra felt a chill crawl up her spine with every sound. Cale paced back and forth, gripping his weapon tightly, his sharp eyes scanning the dark interior. "They're testing us," James muttered, his voice low. He sat on an old crate, staring at the metal door as though he could see right through it. They always do this before they attack. Thyra swallowed hard, her mind racing. "You said they don't like noise. How did you survive this long without them breaking in?" James let out a humorless chuckle. "The ship's hull is tough, and I've learned their patterns. When they get close, I make enough noise to scare them off. But it never lasts for long. They always come back." Cale stopped pacing. "Well, we can't stay here forever. We need to get to our ship and leave this cursed moon." "And how do you plan to do that?" James asked, raising an eyebrow. "They'll be on us the second we step outside." For a moment, no one spoke. The cold air inside the ship felt heavy with tension. Thyra glanced at her scanner, which still picked up movement all around them. The shadows were waiting, watching. "We need a distraction," Thyra said finally. "Something to draw them away long enough for us to get to our ship." Cale scoffed. "That's easier said than done. Those things move faster than we do." James stood up, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Maybe not. I still have the emergency power core from this ship. It's unstable, but if we overload it, it'll blow up," Thyra finished, her eyes widening. James nodded. "Exactly. A blast big enough to light up the whole canyon. The shadows will scatter, at least for a while. It's risky, but it's our best shot." Cale frowned. "And what if it doesn't work? What if they come straight for us anyway?" James met his gaze, his expression hard. "Then we fight." Silence hung between them for a moment. Thyra's heart pounded, but she knew James was right. They had no other choice. "Where's the power core?" Thyra asked. "Back in the engine room," James replied. "But it's old. If I set it to overload, we'll only have a few minutes to get out of here before it blows." "Then let's move," Cale said, his voice firm. The three of them made their way through the dark corridors of the ship, the flickering lantern casting strange shadows on the walls. Thyra's hands trembled as she clutched her scanner. Every step felt like a risk. When they reached the engine room, James knelt beside a large, rusted device. "This is it," he said, wiping frost off its surface. "Once I activate it, we need to run, fast." Thyra nodded, glancing nervously at the door. "We'll be ready." James worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced skill. Sparks flew as he pried open a panel and began rewiring the power core. The hum of energy filled the room, growing louder by the second. "Almost there," James muttered. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the ship, followed by the sound of metal groaning. Thyra's scanner went wild. "They're inside," she shouted. James's head snapped up. I'm done. Move." The three of them ran, the hum of the overloading power core ringing in their ears. Behind them, the shadows scratching grew louder, joined by inhuman shrieks that sent chills down Thyra's spine. As they reached the ship's entrance, James slammed the emergency door shut behind them. "Go. Get to your ship." Outside, the cold air bit at their faces as they sprinted toward Kale's ship in the distance. Thyra didn't dare look back, but she could hear the shadows, fast, relentless, and closing in. A low rumble shook the ground beneath them. The power core was about to blow. "Almost there," Kale shouted. Thyra's lungs burned as they reached the ship. Kale dove into the cockpit, powering up the engines. Thyra and James scrambled inside just as a deafening explosion lit up the sky. The blast rolled through the canyon, shaking the ground and scattering the shadows like dust in the wind. For a moment, everything was silent. Kale pulled the ship into the air, the engines roaring to life. Thyra slumped into her seat, gasping for breath. Beside her, James stared out the window, his expression unreadable. "You did it," Thyra said softly. James exhaled, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "For now." But as the ship soared into the sky, Thyra couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over yet. The ship shot upward, leaving behind the smoldering remains of James's wrecked vessel and the blast's glowing aftermath. For a few moments, it felt like they had escaped. Thyra leaned back in her seat, trying to catch her breath as the adrenaline began to fade. "We made it," Kale said, his voice tight as he gripped the controls. The ship's engines roared as they climbed through the thin atmosphere of Aura's 9. Thyra turned to James, who sat silently staring out the window. His rugged face was tense, his jaw clenched as if he were deep in thought. "You don't look relieved," she said softly. James didn't answer right away. After a moment, he exhaled and turned toward her. "You don't understand. That blast won't stop them for long. It never does." Kale glanced over his shoulder. "What do you mean?" "The explosion wiped them out." James shook his head. "No, it scattered them. But the shadows aren't just creatures. There's something worse." Thyra's brow furrowed. "Worse? What are they?" James rubbed his hands together, his face dark with memories. "I've had years to figure it out. At first, I thought they were animals, things that hunted in the dark. But they're not. They're alive, but they're connected. It's like they're made of the moon itself, like living shadows tied to the ice and stone." Thyra's eyes widened. "The moon?" "Yes," James said. "I think Aura's 9 is alive, or something close to it. It uses the shadows to protect itself. When we crashed here, it didn't attack right away. It watched us, studied us. One by one, the crew disappeared until I was the only one left." Kale shook his head. "That's impossible. A moon can't think. It's just a rock." James's eyes narrowed. "Then explain those things. Explain how they move like shadows and vanish into thin air. They don't need food. They don't leave bodies. And no matter what I do, they never stop hunting me." Silence filled the cockpit. Thyra felt her hands grow clammy. She looked out the window, the pale light of the gas giant reflecting off Aura's 9's surface far below. The moon's icy landscape seemed quiet, but now it felt like something was watching them. "So what happens now?" Thyra asked. "We're off the moon." "We're safe, right?" James shook his head again. "I'm not so sure. If the shadows are tied to the moon, maybe they can't follow us. But what if they're tied to something else? To me?" Kale's grip on the controls tightened. "You're saying we might have brought them with us." Before James could answer, alarms blared throughout the ship. Thyra's scanner lit up with red signals. "Something's here," Kale shouted, his voice sharp with panic. Thyra's heart dropped. That's impossible. There's nothing in space. But as the ship's lights flickered, a dark shape appeared outside the window, tall, thin, and rippling like smoke. Thyra gasped as more shapes emerged from the shadows of the hull, clinging to the ship like living darkness. They followed us, James whispered, his voice hollow. They never stop. The shadows were here. Kale wrestled with the controls. Hold on, I'm taking us to hyperspace. Maybe we can lose them. The ship jolted as Kale punched the engines, the stars outside stretching into bright lines. Thyra gripped her seat as the shadows clawed at the ship, their inky forms swirling and shifting. As the ship roared forward into hyperspace, Thyra looked at James. His face was pale, his eyes filled with something she hadn't seen before, fear. "What are they?" she whispered again. James met her gaze. The end of anyone who gets too close to the truth. For now, they were still alive. But the shadows weren't finished with them yet. The ship shuddered violently as it tore through hyperspace. Alarms screamed, red lights flashing across the cockpit. Thyra's heart pounded as the dark forms of the shadows rippled across the hull, clinging to the ship like black veins. Kale wrestled with the controls. This isn't working. They're still here. How is that possible? Thyra shouted, gripping her seat to keep steady. James's voice was low, haunted. They're not just creatures. They're part of me now. I don't know how, but they're connected. Thyra turned sharply toward him. What do you mean connected? James looked at her, regret in his tired eyes. I think I brought them with me the moment I touched the moon. They're inside me somehow, tied to my existence. I was their anchor. Now they're in your world too. Kale snapped. So what do we do? Let you float out into space? James didn't argue. Instead, his face grew calm, determined. That might be the only way. Thyra froze, staring at him. What are you saying? James stood up, steady despite the shaking ship. I can feel them pulling at me. If I stay on this ship, they'll tear it apart. But if I leave, maybe they'll follow me. Maybe I can draw them away. No. Thyra stood, her voice cracking. You can't do that. We didn't come this far to lose you now. James smiled faintly, a sad but gentle smile. You came to find the truth, right? Well, the truth comes with a price. Kale glanced back at them, sweat on his brow. We don't have time for this. We'll be dead in minutes. James moved to the airlock, pulling a tattered jacket tight around his shoulders. Open the lock when I say. I'll go out and I'll make sure they come with me. Thyra's chest tightened. She wanted to argue, to beg him to find another way. But deep down, she knew James was right. The shadows were tied to him. He was their anchor. James, she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. He paused, looking back at her. Humans. We survive, Thyra. It's what we do. You take this story back to your people. Tell them we were real. Tell them we fought. Kale's voice crackled over the comms. We're out of time. It's now or never. James turned, his face steady as stone. Do it. Kale hesitated, then hit the airlock release. A loud hiss filled the ship as the outer doors opened. Wind roared through the corridor, pulling James toward the void of space. As he stepped into the airlock, James looked up one last time. He saluted Thyra with a crooked smile. Take care of yourselves, Azari. And then he was gone. Thyra watched, her heart breaking, as James's body drifted into the darkness. The shadows followed him, their black forms peeling away from the ship, swirling after him like a storm. For the first time, the ship grew still. Kale closed the airlock, his voice heavy. He did it. They're gone. Thyra sank into her seat, staring into the endless void outside the window. James was gone, but his sacrifice had saved them. The myths of humanity weren't just stories. They were real. Humans were survivors, stronger than anyone could have imagined. And now she would carry his story back to Zareth. Thyra wiped her eyes, her voice steady as she whispered, "Thank you, James." The ship roared back to life, carrying them away from Aura's 9. The shadows were gone, but Thyra knew she would never forget the human who had defied them, who had proven that even in the darkest places, humanity's strength could shine.